Hello and welcome to this Chemistry World webinar, LGBTQ+ in STEM, using data to foster inclusion, part 1. I'm Natalie Starkey, Chemistry World's science media producer, and I'm here with you for the next hour. Now, for anyone who's attended a Chemistry World webinar before, you might notice that GoToWebinar looks a little bit different today as we're trialling the new software update. So feel free to explore the layout, as you should be able to resize boxes and zoom in to make things look as you'd like them to. The questions box works the same, so send in your questions for the speakers there, and we'll send you any links and other messages as usual in the chat box. You should also have the option to turn on closed captions, which is quite a new thing for us, so that's exciting as well. Obviously, everything looks different on different platforms, so it does depend what platform you're using, but do contact us in the questions box if you've got any questions about it. Now, this webinar is the first part of a two-part series where we're working together alongside the RSC's Inclusion and Diversity team. The second part of the series is coming up on the 18th of July, where we'll hear from two other winners of the RSC LGBT+ Inclusion in STEM grant. We'll share the link to register for that in the chat box, and it's on the screen now. If you're watching on the recorded version of this event, then that webinar might already have taken place, in which case you can go to the same link directly to watch the recording. Now, I don't want to take up too much of your time before handing over to our brilliant speakers today, but I wanted to let you know that, as with all Chemistry World webinars, this session is interactive, which of course means you can ask questions about any aspect of what's covered in today's event. So as I said, please use the questions box to send in your questions as soon as they come to mind, and our moderator for today, who we'll introduce shortly, will put those questions to our panel of guests in the live Q&A in the second half of the webinar. Now, you won't usually be able to see other people's questions in there, but don't worry, because myself and the Chemistry World Webinars team can, so do start sending them in soon. But without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Ali Palermo, who I'll welcome on the screen now. Just see if we can get her camera on and get her audio sorted. There she is. Welcome, Ali.
Thank you very much.
Ali, hello. So Ali is the head of global inclusion at the RSC, and she's going to say a few words about the RSC's work and efforts to foster inclusion for the LGBTQ+ community in STEM before she hands over to our moderator Kevin and our speakers Joanna and Bryce. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to pass over to Ali to begin, and then I'll be back right at the end of the webinar. So we've got some slides now, and I'll leave it with you, Ali.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. As Natalie's mentioned, I am Head of Global Inclusion at the Royal Society of Chemistry. I'm a scientist and a former academic and researcher. Our team works in developing and implementing the overall inclusion and diversity strategy for the chemical sciences community. And also are responsible for large international programs which are key priorities for the Royal Society of Chemistry, which involves working with the global community and with chemical societies and key partners across the world. Our common objective is to drive change towards an inclusive global science culture. So thank you very much for joining us today. There is plenty of evidence that science benefits from a diversity of perspectives, experiences, and backgrounds. Inclusion and diversity and creating a feeling of belonging lead to better science, better innovation, and ultimately benefit society at large. However, there is clear evidence that minority groups are badly underrepresented in STEM subjects. Both in the UK and in the US, LGBT+ people are not always welcomed in STEM subjects, with a consequent lack of retention and disempowering of individuals. In 2019, we published a joint report with the Institute of Physics and the Royal Astronomical Society, investigating the climate for LGBT+ individuals working and studying in the physical sciences. Our research showed that 28% of LGBT+ respondents have sometimes considered leaving their career in STEM. When looking at responses from trans and non-binary individuals, 20% of them have often considered leaving their workplace. And if we want to retain the best talent in science, we need to provide LGBT+ individuals with a welcoming environment, as currently they are more likely to leave their profession. Governments in the UK and other organisations in the UK and in the US are eager to create evidence-based retention policies. The problem, however, is that there are limited data available to make informed decisions. The UK and the US are together more than the sum of our parts on this issue, and we collect different types of data which together are extremely powerful. So we were very pleased to partner with the Science and Innovation Network in the US on a new powerful research scheme funded by the UK government, by the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology in the UK. The scheme supports 5 research collaborations as pilot studies to actively investigate attrition and retention of LGBT+ groups in STEM. These unique projects bring together STEM researchers and also social scientists to develop new transatlantic collaborations. The findings from this research will directly feed into evidence to build policies to address attrition and retention of LGBT+ scientists in the 2 countries. So we must continue to work together so that STEM is truly for everyone. Creating an inclusive culture is essential not only for the LGBT+ community, but for everyone. And this will lead to better science, but ultimately to a more sustainable and successful society. So today we are very excited to welcome grant holders to share their work. And for this, I have the great pleasure to introduce Kevin Coutinho, who is the moderator for this webinar. Kevin has been a member of the Inclusion and Diversity Committee at the Royal Society of Chemistry for the last 6 years, providing invaluable insights and inspiration to our work. Kevin is an equality practitioner within higher education and the voluntary sector. He chairs the Board of Trustees for the Windsor Fellowship, a race equality and diversity charity that promotes education, citizenship, and employability. So Kevin, all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. I must say I was truly delighted to be asked to moderate this webinar. For me, promoting inclusion combined with collaborative research is simply good practice, and the more we have of this, the better. Today, we're lucky to hear from 2 inspirational speakers who will tell us about their work and their motivations to improve LGBTQ+ inclusion in STEM using an evidence-based approach. As Ali noted, the speakers today are winners of the prestigious LGBT+ Inclusion in STEM grants. This scheme is designed to bring together different perspectives across the UK and the United States and the social and STEM sciences. Using a transatlantic and interdisciplinary lens, these projects will build the necessary evidence and data knowledge for policymakers to create targeted interventions to support LGBTQ+ communities in STEM across the 2 countries and beyond. The 2 grant recipients will tell us about their projects, and I thank them in advance for taking the time to join us today. We have asked each speaker to give us a short 10-minute presentation to provide an overview of their project. We will then move on to a discussion session where speakers will be able to answer questions about their work. And as Natalie flagged up earlier, I'm going to encourage you to put your questions into the questions tab in the chat. Joining us today are Dr. Ioana Latu. Ioana is a senior lecturer in experimental social psychology at Queen's University, Belfast, in Northern Ireland. Ioana's research focuses on understanding and reducing intergroup biases, with a specific focus on gender biases in organizational and academical contexts. Her current research seeks to understand and improve attitudes towards equality initiatives, including gender and LGBTQ plus inclusion initiatives in the academic STEM field. The second speaker is Assistant Professor Bryce Hughes. Bryce is an Associate Professor in Education at Montana State University in the United States. His work highlights the disproportionate rates at which LGBTQ plus students leave STEM fields. His recent NSF Career Award focuses on understanding the experiences of LGBTQ plus students in STEM majors, investigating students' social networks, degree completion rates, and science and engineering identities. I would like now to invite Joanna to give us a presentation about her project, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, investigating presence, perceptions, and engagements with LGBTQ plus inclusion symbols in STEM departments in the UK and the USA. Thank you, Joanna, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for the introduction, but also for organizing and inviting me to this webinar. It's really exciting to be here and share our project, but also the initial findings. This is actually the first time we're sharing them because they're just, we're just done collecting the data. But I also look forward to the discussion and hearing all the ideas shared here. So this is research that is funded by, as Ali said, by the Royal Society of Chemistry as part of the grant scheme that she announced. And it's done in collaboration with Dr. Phoebe McKenna Plumley, who is the postdoc working on this project, but also Dr. Terry Kirby, who is an assistant professor at Purdue University, assistant professor in psychology. So we started this project with an observation, and the observation is that inclusion symbols, and when I say this, I refer to rainbow flags, lanyards, pins, use of pronouns for emails, pride participation, and so on. They are present in organizations, including STEM academic departments, and they are meant to signal LGBTQ plus inclusion. And we think this is great, right? Because the onus should be on the organization and not on LGBTQ plus people to model and signal inclusion. But the question that came up to us is, to what extent are these symbols really effective in creating a safe place or in signaling the safety of that environment? And this is what we wanted to investigate. So the first objective was to investigate what LGBTQ plus inclusion symbols are used by UK and US STEM departments. A second one was to explore how these symbols are perceived by STEM students and academics within their institutions and the wider context. And the idea here is that these symbols, although they seem great, may not always be perceived positively. And they can potentially be perceived as inauthentic or performative or even sometimes hypocritical if the overall inclusion climate within that organization is not positive. So to what extent are they positively perceived? Also, if those symbols are so the third objective was to find out what psychological factors predict willingness to engage with these symbols. So if these symbols are overall helpful in signaling a safe space, how can we improve academics' willingness to engage with them? How can we get people to use more rainbow lanyards, use pronouns, support pride, and so on, if those really signal a safe space? So we've proposed 3 studies. The first one is more of a pilot study where we just wanted to investigate within the group of partners that we had, 7 UK and US universities, particularly chemistry departments, what symbols, initiative, and policies are present. The second study is a mixed method survey, which means that we combine quantitative and qualitative data. And we looked at how are symbols perceived by STEM academics and students by using questionnaires that I'll talk about in a minute, and how do department, university, state, and national inclusion climate affect those perceptions. And we also looked at how LGBTQ plus group membership and career stage affect those perceptions. So again, this is getting to that question of, is there an effect of the overall inclusion climate in the way that people perceive those symbols? And then the third study will be about engagement. So it will be an experimental study where we vary factors that look at what predicts people's willingness to engage with the symbols. So We have so far findings from the desk research and the study one on the perception. So this is what I'm going to present to you right now. So for the desk research, which I told you that it's more of a pilot research, we looked at, we collected data online via a questionnaire amongst our UK and US STEM partners, and 6 of them responded. So we got information from 6 departments across the UK and the US. And this one investigated what symbols and policies are present within their departments. So just a simple investigation so we see how we can continue on with the next study. What we found is that rainbow lanyards, department-wide pride celebrations, and use of pronouns are the most common symbols of LGBT inclusion used. And in terms of what are the inclusion and equality initiatives present, 5 out of the 6 respondents identified that there is such a policy or an initiative present. So while there are initiatives present, it's not always the case. So this was great because we got some initial information that we can design our first study on. So in the first study, and I must say that we've just finished collecting these data, so it's really fresh for me too, so excited to share these. We got responses from 365 participants, but only 256 are complete data. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the characteristics of our sample, and then I'm going to go into the details of what we found. So we have a mean age of 30 years old, but with a wide range of ages. We have about half women respondents, 40% men, and 6.3% non-binary, 2% genderqueer. We also have 10% of our sample was identified as trans. And around 46% identified as being part of the LGBTQ+ community. The majority of our participants were white, and in terms of the discipline they came from, because our contacts through which we disseminated our questionnaires were in chemistry, almost half of the sample comes from chemistry, but we have other sciences represented too, such as physics, astronomy, life sciences, and so on. In terms of location, we made an attempt to get data from both the US and the UK. So we have 40% from the US, 40% from England, 13.7% from Northern Ireland. This is such a high percentage because we're based in Northern Ireland, and around 5% from Scotland. And then we have data nested within 17 universities and then 54 departments nested within those universities. So I would say we're pretty happy with our sample and its diversity on most of those characteristics, at least when we benchmark it against some of the demographics of this population. Okay, so what are the findings? I'm sure you're all wondering about that. So if you remember, our main outcome was, or our main question was, how positive, authentic, effective, or sincere do you perceive those symbols of inclusion, such as rainbow flags, pride, participation, and pronouns? So we had people rate, how positive, how authentic, and these all merged together on a scale from 1 to 10. And here, I'm going to show you some initial findings that show that we don't see as many significant differences among groups. So when it comes to perception of LGBTQ+ inclusion symbols, both straight, cisgender, and LGBTQ+ respondents felt equally positive. Also, there is no significant difference between students and academic staff. There are no significant differences among different genders. You see slightly higher rates of support or positivity among women, but these differences are not significant. And we didn't see any significant differences between our US and UK sample. Okay, so what does this all mean? Again, this is preliminary data, but the good news, I would say, of this take-home message is that perception of symbols are relatively positive. So if you see the scale there, it's from 1 to 10, and most of those means are generally above 7 on a 10-point scale. So they're definitely above the midpoint. There might be a selection bias there too, because we've recruited via our networks, which are probably positive in regards to inclusion. Second, positive perceptions tend to be uniform, so they don't tend to differ between different categories. And third, remember our main question was around inclusion climate. To what extent are symbols perceived less positively if the inclusion climate is not positive? So we conducted some initial complex multi-level analyses, which are still in initial phases, but they show that inclusion climate, whether it's the department or the state level or the country level, it doesn't seem to play a role. So what this means is that respondents perceive symbols positively regardless of the inclusion climate. I think this is great news, and now we have a clear path forward. So what's our path forward? Well, we will complete the data analysis and look also at the qualitative data that we got. And then we will do an experimental study on engagement with symbols. So now that we see that those are generally perceived positive regardless of the inclusion climate, we have more confidence to say, well, these are good to use, right? Because they do signal inclusion and they create positive allyship within those departments. And then we will have an advisory group meeting with our partners to discuss what are the policy implications of our findings, because it's also important that we turn these into any recommendations for policy. So I want to end this by saying that we don't have any studies open now, but if you're interested in this, in participating or disseminating ideas around study 2, which will be about how we can increase engagement with these inclusion symbols, I have a QR code here that you can scan and leave us your email address, and then we can contact you once we're ready to launch the study 2, and you can participate in it, or we can give you more information about it. But I also wanted to say that our email addresses are here. This is mine, and also Phoebe, who is the postdoc on this project and very actively involved in this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joanna. We will save questions, if that's okay, for after the second presentation. I'm going to ask Associate Professor Bryce Hughes if you'd like to come on, and he'll be speaking about centering LGBTQ plus perspectives in STEM career decision making. Bryce, if we can invite you on to take the microphone.
Thank you so much for the invitation, as well as the opportunity to be able to conduct this research. My name is Bryce Hughes. I'm an Associate Professor of Education at Montana State University, and I'm pleased to present on behalf of our project team, which includes Dr. Clara Barker in Materials Science at Oxford University, and Dr. Lisa Smith, who works with the Jacobs Institute for Innovation and Education with the University of San Diego, with our project centering LGBT plus perspectives in STEM career decision making. The context for this study comes from possibly both Clara and I have the experience of having left STEM when we talk about our story in why we're still engaged with this work now. For Clara, it was being pushed out of an academic STEM department and then finding her way back through engaging in activism around particularly trans inclusion within the sciences. For me, it was leaving engineering, not quite realizing that the climate had played such an important role in my experience as an undergraduate until I came back to this research as a PhD student and got involved with studying inclusion in STEM along the lines of gender and race, asking some questions about other dimensions that hadn't been covered as extensively at that point, which was probably about a decade ago. In order to solve the kinds of problems that we need the input of the sciences and engineering, we realized that broad inclusion helps broaden the amount of perspectives available to look into solutions, as well as the kinds of questions that we're asking regarding the social impact of science and engineering within the world. Both the US and the UK also recognize that industry and research around STEM fields are important economic drivers in both national contexts and rely on each other as important global partners that have retained a special relationship for about more than a century at this point. Data from both countries, as was presented earlier, show that LGBT plus people are leaving STEM at higher rates than their colleagues at all points, starting from when they are in their undergraduate programs of study all the way through various points in their careers. Yet losing these perspectives does mean science loses out in the ability to draw from a multitude of perspectives. And so the research we wanted to look into was, what are the factors that LGBT plus people who are leaving STEM, they weigh the heaviest when they're making that decision? Like I said, some of this was personally inspired, but also some of this comes from having been involved in research looking at what helps students remain in STEM, realizing that what a lot of people want to know is also, for those who decide not to stay, what was it that influenced that decision? And was it a factor that could be influenced by, say, a college or university, a workplace, and so on, as opposed to simply just a shift in someone's career or just a shift in someone's interests? What we're looking at then is, how do we develop a profile of different decision-making processes, different groups of people who leave STEM, to see if there might be discernible patterns that would then help lead to important policy implications. Our project then is broken down into 3 specific aims, one that we are in the throes of right now, and one that will follow that up this fall, with a theoretical stage at the very end. So the first is to identify factors that shape people's decisions to leave a STEM major or a career, which is a qualitative phase through collecting interview data. The second is then to parse out from the results of those interviews factors that we can put into a survey to help understand latent profiles or latent patterns of decision making broadly that help us understand at a higher level reasons that people decide to leave their academic major or career. And then finally, bringing all that data together to develop a model of career decision making that looks across national contexts and centers LGBT plus identities. At this point, we are well within our recruitment phase for the qualitative study. The first step that we took was to send invitations to, we put together a screening survey to try to understand, to try to put together a very diverse pool of people to interview, and distributed that invitation for the screening survey through all kinds of networks. And we're still in the midst of that, and I've got a code at the end in case there's anybody who might meet the criteria who's interested in participating. We also spent time developing an interview protocol based on capturing the stories into, through, and out of STEM. Following this, we will engage in content analysis on the interview transcripts that come from the various interviews we perform, and we're aiming for approximately 50 interviews, half in the US and half in the UK, with then a latent class analysis of survey data developed out of the results of that interview. So far, we've received robust response in the US, and we're still in the midst of recruiting the UK. We've received 61 responses to the screening survey from the US, with 17 from the UK. But we were really pleased, at least among the US participants so far, with the diversity of the sample, that we ended up sending out some invitations. More than half indicated a gender identity that fell within what we would call the trans umbrella, that they're transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender queer, agender, and so on. About a third of our sample identifies their sexual orientation as bisexual, and another third use a different term, like, say, queer. I'm trying to think of the other ones. Asexual would be another one. Over 60% of our respondents indicated having a disability in terms of other forms of inclusion, and nearly a third were people of color in terms of their race or ethnicity. Most of our respondents were in engineering or computer science, well over half, but then we have some respondents from biology, chemistry, and some other fields, and those are areas that we're still recruiting in terms of broadening the representation of STEM fields in the sample. Resulting so far in 16 people from the US that have interest in scheduling interviews, and several more that we are in the midst of identifying. But I think the biggest question that started to come up that I think is also going to be really important in parsing our interview findings is the anecdotal evidence we received as we sent invitations out for people to take this survey, asking us whether they met the criteria. All we asked them was, if you're someone who has left STEM at some point, we would like to interview you, fill out the screening survey, and then we'll follow up with an invitation. And we've gotten a lot of emails back asking, well, what do you mean by leaving STEM? One person had indicated that they didn't hold a formal position within STEM. Someone else mentioned that they had a STEM career, but they didn't necessarily leave STEM entirely. They just left, say, industry. And from our perspective, with it being a qualitative study, it's meant to be exploratory. And so I've told them, if you think you've left STEM, we'd like to interview you. But it will be interesting to find out what that means as well, in addition to what kinds of factors weighed into that decision. Overall, the project we expect to impact both how we understand why STEM fields struggle to retain this talent, obviously to compare the transnational context to make sure that we've explored the diverse experiences within LGBT+ communities, and then to identify implications for data collection policies and programs that can help us better monitor the problem and come up with solutions, especially interventions. We've also, as I mentioned, started asking questions about what does leaving STEM mean, as well as how do people who've been trained in STEM benefit other sectors of the economy or sectors of society that it may be beneficial to have people disperse in and out of STEM career trajectories throughout their lives. And then finally, how might this help industry and academic departments better serve LGBT+ people? This final slide, and I've got one right after this with a QR code like Ioana posted, is if you are somebody who has left STEM and you are interested in being invited to be interviewed, we're still recruiting, and we'd definitely love to welcome your participation in the study. You can either get the QR code here or follow up afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bryce, for that insightful presentation, as well as Ioana's. And it's a really interesting combination of symbolisms, but also lived experiences, and trying to get that blend of qualitative and quantitative data together, looking at how people perceive this. So we're going to move on to the questions and answers session. And I can see that we've received some questions already. So my first question, if I may, is for Ioana. What, in your opinion, are the contemporary roles of different organizations and institutions, such as STEM departments and universities, in facilitating or inhibiting the retention of LGBTQ+ scientists?
Thank you so much for this question, Kevin. And I'm sure that in terms of the retention, Bryce's project, which is so interesting, will help us understand a little bit more there. So what I'll speak to is more generally what I would see the roles there. So I think, like any organization, STEM departments have the responsibility to create an inclusion climate and our research shows that using symbols of inclusion helps with that. We know from social psychology research that role models help with inclusion. So seeing somebody like you who has succeeded is always helpful. But in this case, it's a bit difficult because the onus shouldn't be on LGBTQ+ scientists to be out or to work for the inclusion, right? So this is why I think it's a responsibility of the organization to promote those symbols and to make sure that the inclusion climate is backed up by actual actions. I think we live during a time when there are more and more attacks against EDI in general, and particularly against LGBTQ+ people and scientists. So I think organizations have this role of also protecting people from those attacks, from those external attacks. And a lot of it is on social media, right? But it can still be very damaging to people. And we know this from psychology also. There's something called minority stress model, that being exposed to discrimination can lead to negative physical and mental health effects. So we do have the responsibility to protect from this. And I think finally, it's about belonging, not just hiring. So we often think about inclusion at the organizational level as having inclusive hiring practices, but fostering that sense of belonging through all those, topics that we mentioned and Bryce mentioned too. I think that's quite important. So thinking through, what does it mean to belong in STEM, and using evidence-based methods to understand and promote that.
Yeah. Next question is for you, and it's really thinking about the perspectives of LGBTQ plus individuals who have left STEM and intersectionality, so bringing the two together. Can you expand on how experiences for specific groups that make up our LGBTQ plus community can differ from each other?
Oh, absolutely. So I think there's two ways that we're thinking about intersectionality within LGBTQ plus communities. One of those would be the vast diversity of experiences that that are encompassed within those letters LGBTQ plus, especially folks who are transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary, and so on, whose needs tend to get overlooked when we look at LGBTQ plus as a monolithic community, as this singular experience. There are obviously some shared commonalities around the kinds of hostility that people might experience from, say, colleagues or strangers and so on, that microaggressions and so on that are common, they're experienced by different kinds of minoritized people. But then there are some specific experiences related to gender identity that would differ from sexual orientation, such as access to facilities in a work environment, or being misgendered, being referred to by the wrong gender pronouns within the work environment, being referred to by the wrong name, and so on. That would be unique, that would not necessarily have been encompassed by just saying, oh, we're just going to look at LGBTQ plus people broadly, and realize that without attention and oversampling, we might miss some of those perspectives. The second is the way that LGBTQ identities intersect with other identities that have also historically been excluded from STEM. The two that get discussed the most are race and ethnicity, racial and ethnic background, and gender in terms of cisgender women, the experiences of cisgender women. Both of those also risk being overlooked when we're not necessarily being attentive to the fact that white gay men will have a different experience than Black lesbian women, or Asian trans women, and so on, that we're not as attentive to the fact that what someone might be experiencing may actually be related to their ethnicity, if we've just put them in this category of, oh, we're only looking at you as somebody who is part of a sexual or gender minority. And I think that's what's also useful about doing some qualitative work, is that we can hear from people about the complexity of their experiences and allow them to share what's going on for them, as opposed to us just saying, well, we've categorized them one way and we're limited by our data in terms of how we can look at that. And so some of the ways that people of color and women have historically been marginalized in STEM will show up in our sample. And we'll need to be attentive to that. I mean, even some of the qualitative work I've done with undergraduate students have shown several students say, my sexual orientation has been less salient to my experiences in STEM than my gender or than my ethnicity, and then to allow them to be able to expand on that. So some of it allows us to then let the participant help define what it is that they're experiencing and how that is still relevant because they are a member of this LGBTQ plus community as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I think teasing out the specific experiences of different members of our communities and understanding the layered nature of identities actually poses some challenges, because sometimes the size of the community is quite small relatively to the majoritized community. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why mixed methodology becomes relevant for us. And so what I wanted to ask, I'm going to ask you, Anna, first, if I may, is can you explain a little bit more about the mixed methodologies and the mixed methods and experimental studies, and what was the method used for each to carry out the research?
Sure, and I actually have here some results from the qualitative stuff too. So by mixed methods, the way we understand it is that we combine what we get from the quantitative and the qualitative data. So what we did was an online survey that contained scales where participants had to rate, for example, perception of inclusion symbols from 1 to 10, perception of inclusion climate from 1 to 10. So those, and that gives us more that quantitative data. But we also wanted to give a voice to people responding to this. So we asked some open-ended questions where they could add anything that they wanted around those questions too. So we realized that sometimes scales are limited. People feel, maybe choose a 9 for different reasons, right? May choose a 1 for different reasons. So we wanted to give them the opportunity to speak more in detail about the experience and their perceptions. And indeed, 174 of our participants, so over half of the sample, I would say, put in some qualitative comments that we are in the process now of integrating with the quantitative information. So when we look at kind of the comments that people put in, we see that indeed that they support some of the quantitative findings, with LGBTQ plus symbols being commonly viewed as valuable, and people say that it sometimes even goes beyond LGBTQ inclusion. If they see a rainbow lanyard with somebody, they know that's a safe person, for other identities too. But then there are some nuances there that maybe kind of don't go, they're not extremely consistent with the quantitative data, and this is where we'll have to do the work of trying to identify what's going on. And those are things around, they are perceived, sometimes symbols are perceived as disingenuous or inauthentic, that people appreciate more when they're used by individuals within the organization rather than the organization itself. So this is future work. As I said, we've just completed the data collection, but this is how we're going to try to kind of put it together and make sense of how they go together, and where are some sources of information that we can kind of tap into a little bit more.
It's very interesting that you teased out the fact that it could be individuals rather than organization adoption. And one of the questions that's come from our audience is about to what extent or the degree to which these symbols contribute to an inclusion culture. Is there anything that you've learned from the project and the research you've undertaken?
Yeah, so this is what and of course it's hard. It was a hard thing also statistically for us to kind of, do we have what we would call multicollinearity? Like they all correlate, right? The ratings of the perception of the symbols and the inclusion climate correlate, and it's kind of a chicken or the egg, right, thing where you don't know, are the inclusions creating the symbols creating the inclusion climate, or is the inclusion climate creating the symbol use or determining that, or is there like a two-way relationship between those? They're definitely correlated, and I think they do, what our findings, at least the quantitative findings so far, show that they do serve to create that, and they're, generally perceived as authentic in creating that inclusion climate. But I think there's a lot more to be understood of how they can use most efficiently, so that they're not, and there's antagonistic attitudes for different reasons, right? Some people may perceive them as disingenuous, but some people, some were saying even in the qualitative comments that if they're overused, those symbols, they may lead to antagonism against them. So those are, scientists or members of the LGBTQ plus community who are worried that an overuse would lead to, more attacks and more negative attitudes. So I think we need to find that, and it's going to be different for each organization and each inclusion climate, but we're going to have to to kind of try to understand how they can be best used to create that inclusion climate. So that's a great question.
Well, thank you. Raisa, do you want to add anything to the mixed methods question?
Sure, because ours is ultimately a mixed methods project too, in that the second phase will take what we learned from the qualitative phase and basically send this out to a much larger group of people to have them rate the extent to which different factors may have weighed into their own decision making for what a latent class analysis, which is almost like a quantification of a qualitative process using statistics to see, do these factors group in meaningful ways that we can then actually interpret as researchers. So that's kind of the qualitative side of doing that work. And then, of course, all the research that I've done prior to this is also mixed methods as well. Being able to understand whether or not LGBTQ plus students leave a STEM program of study at a higher rate. But I've also had the chance to then ask people in interviews about that finding and what their thoughts are and why they think that's happening as well. But I think it's useful for understanding the question that you asked about the broader culture of inclusion, because I will say when I talk to students about their experiences within different departments, I don't think I've had a student not say that seeing symbols like a sign on a faculty member's door that they show support, or the kinds of events that are happening within their department, or the fact that they host a chapter of a student organization that's for LGBTQ students who are in STEM fields. I don't usually ask them about that. They bring that up as part of their experience in the process. So it's kind of nice to see then some work around, well, what kind of an impact does that actually have beyond sort of a superficial, yes, it makes me feel better to see this than to not see it. Because they do also recognize, I think, as Ioana said, they recognize when it gets to be a bit performative. And I imagine we'll see the same thing with ours too.
So building on that, Bryce, are there any key underpinning principles that should inform the design of evidence-based interventions to stop the attrition or mitigate the attrition of LGBTQ plus communities in STEM?
Yes. Knowing what people say about the importance of some of the organizational symbols, I know students talk about the presence of clubs. I expect professionals to talk about whether or not they have opportunities to gather with people who they share affinity with in their workspace. Some organizations are large enough that there might be an affinity group for LGBT plus individuals within that company. And then there are organizations, broadly speaking, professional societies that target LGBT plus working professionals within STEM fields, like Pride in STEM, and in the US, Out to Innovate's what it's called now. And so being able to find community in that sense and have their organization support that as well, I expect will be a really important implication of this. But honestly, I think the part that I'm not even sure we'll be able to parse out with this study alone, that I'm questioning a lot, is how do you deliver this kind of content to the organization broadly, say through training and development, to help people understand what kinds of behaviors are negatively impacting the work environment and what kinds of behaviors would help positively impact the work environment, to help build better interpersonal relationships, intergroup relations, and especially for leaders within these organizations to lead in a way that incentivizes producing the culture that we're looking for, the active role that leaders can play in shaping the culture in their maybe it's an academic department or a work environment. Like I said, I don't know if our study will specifically find the answer to that, but I think we'll get a little bit closer by understanding what it is that had driven somebody out of a particular work environment, or maybe a field more broadly speaking.
Thank you. Joanna, did you have anything that you'd like to add on that particular question about principles that should underpin or inform the design of evidence-based interventions to stop or mitigate the attrition of LGBTQ plus communities in science and STEM?
Yeah, I think Bryce covered most of the, like the most important factors around that. I guess that, is to maintain that standard of evidence-based, and we, luckily we have more and more research underpinning this, but those projects, are the best because they can gather that evidence. But no, I think Bryce said it very well.
Thank you. So specifically then, Joanna, I wanted to find out whether you would be able to contrast the information in the United States or between the Southeast and the rest of the country, particularly as the South is blocking DEI-RB policies.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't have such a detailed analysis yet, and I like to speak with the data in front of me. Overall, we don't see differences between the UK and the US in terms of perception of symbols, as I've shown. But looking at the qualitative comments that we've just extracted in the last few days, it does seem that the US participants, and again, these are academics and students from US universities, comment a lot more on the variation among the different regions compared to the UK participants, where maybe the situation is a little bit more homogeneous, although there are differences there too, like Northern Ireland would be more conservative, I would say, but still you wouldn't see those same kind of comments, potentially because the state policies, state level policies are more impactful in the US. So, I can quote from some of the participants in the US, how accepting people are is extremely dependent on the location. I'm in state this, town this, but in the other, the town next door, it's a lot less inclusive. So there seems to just be more concern in the US about those local differences compared to the UK, but we haven't gone to that level of analysis where we can see that those differences and analyze them by region yet. We do have quite a few departments included, so we might be able to do that. Overall, it seems like it's not affecting the perception of symbols and the extent to which they create safe spaces. So those are great regardless of the inclusion climate, but I'll get back to you on this in terms of the regional differences for sure.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm afraid we've really come towards the end of our time. In terms of the Q&A, but I'm going to ask both of our speakers if they have any particular salient takeaway, literally in 30 seconds, if I could, that they'd like to just flag up. So I'm going to start with Joanna, if I may.
I think my takeaway from this is that despite, I guess I'll get personal here, despite sometimes being I think when you do work around inclusion, whether it's gender, LGBT, you can sometimes get down, a little bit by seeing all the text against EDI, especially at the university level. So it's really hopeful to see such a community, exchange in such important research being taken over. So I'm taking a positive message out of this, that, there is work being done, there are voices that are being heard. And that is a great thing. I think that kind of gives me a boost and motivating me to move forward.
Thank you. A very positive message there. Bryce.
I would say I'm fully expecting a lot of our participants to tell us that they really haven't fully left STEM altogether, that many of them have moved into areas of policy, science communication, and advocacy. So they're still tied to their passion for science, but now they're also involved in creating the kinds of change that we've been talking about here in this seminar as well.
Thank you. I think there's a really interesting, I've really enjoyed the presentations. I've been part of this project for over a year and a half, and I think what it's done for me is highlighted, at least from today's presentations, the importance of symbols and how important the symbols are, irrespective of a broader challenge to culture or cultural inclusion. And I think there's a key message that science loses out when LGBTQ plus members of our community leave STEM. And based on those 2 points, I'm going to have to recognize the work of our partners in making this research possible. I have to also thank the Inclusion and Diversity team at the Royal Society of Chemistry for facilitating this work, because it is innovative and collaborative international research, particularly around data, where data is gathered in so many different ways, can be particularly challenging. So I want to flag that this work would not be possible without the contribution of organizations. I also want to take the opportunity to remind you that there are many inclusion and diversity resources that are produced by the Royal Society of Chemistry, which are available from the website, and the links will be put into the chat. There's a particular number of toolkits, one for LGBTQ plus toolkit, and also most recently our Disability Web Hub. They're available to everybody, and they're designed to support individuals, employers, and institutions to foster a more inclusive and welcoming community. And as a result of this, we hope that everybody who can contribute to STEM, who has STEM capital, STEM potential, can realize that potential in our community for the betterment of themselves as individuals, but for society as a whole. And on that note, I'm going to remind you all that there's a second webinar that you can participate and attend, and those details are already available. And that's part 2, it's on the 18th of July. And we'll be hearing from 2 other speakers who've received funding from this initiative. So on that note, have a lovely afternoon and goodbye. And thank you to our speakers, of course.
Thank you so much. I've shared all the links in the chat so that people can see those, and if they need to click on them to sign up for the next webinar, that's brilliant. And I just want to, echo what you've just said. Thank you so much to our speakers, Joanna and Bryce. That was brilliant. I've learned a lot about the work that you're doing, and I'm excited to see what's coming. And thank you also, Kevin, for moderating so brilliantly today. And of course, thank you to Ali, who joined us at the start. And thank you so much to all of you for sending in questions. It's been brilliant in the chat box, really positive chat box, lots of people interested about the work that's going on, which we always love to see. Finally, if you've enjoyed this webinar, then please do check out otherchemistryworld.com/webinars on our website, for our future events. We've got a whole range of things coming up. And then from everyone here at Chemistry World and all our speakers today, we look forward to seeing you again in a future Chemistry World webinar. Thank you and goodbye.